So in this video, I'm going to be talking about on-camera bounce flash and how to do it and why we do it. Let's get into it. So the main disadvantage with on-camera flash, especially if you just aim it straight at your subject like this, is you get this blaster flash that's coming from a very small light source and it can look quite harsh. There is a fad at the moment where this has become popular again. It's not going to last and we're going to be going back to bouncing flash probably quite soon. In this picture here that I'll show you from Wedding, this is using bounce flash. And what you can do with bounce flash is you can make it look soft like it's window light. You can make it look as if it's not actually flash lit if you can get your ratios right. I will be talking about how to do that a bit in this video as well. What we're doing is we're effectively trying to change what is the source of light in the picture. So if this is going straight at my subject, this is the light source. If I turn my flash to the side and aim it at a wall, then the light's going to come out of here, hit the wall and bounce back and hit my subject. So whilst this is technically still the source of the light, the wall then becomes the light source for my subject. And that means that as the light comes out of the flash, it spreads, it gets wider, it travels and hits the wall. And by the time it hits the wall, it's already illuminating a large section of that wall. And then that becomes a large light source for my subject, which is a bit like shooting with an umbrella or a softbox off camera. So that's what we're doing, is we're sort of saying that's going to become my reflector, and then it's bouncing the light back to the subject. And the point of doing that is that we're going to get a softer light and it's going to be directional. And it's really important that it's directional because that's going to give us the shape as well. And we can control the power level from the back of the flash. We can shoot it manually and just turn the power levels up and down as we need, or we can use something called TTL, which is like an auto mode that the camera can do for us. But I think you should at least learn how to do this manually. And the great thing is you can practice this around the house. So let's go through the process sort of from start to finish, so it's kind of logical. So in my exposure, let's take that wedding picture as an example. I want to set my exposure actually for the background so the background looks nice. That means I'm going to be slightly darker and I can ignore my subject when it comes to using flash lighting because I'm going to light them separately. So I can expose for everything except my subject. So I might go half a stop to one stop underexposed, and that's going to allow that color from the ambient lights to come back in. But whatever it is, even if it's just that I get a normal exposure, you know, my exposure meter is leveled, but the light on my subject isn't good. So you can see from the way I'm describing that bounce flash is a really good technique to use when I have maybe interesting lighting in the picture. It's just that I haven't got good quality light on my subject. And that's when I'll introduce flash because I can set my exposure for everything else in the picture and I can light my subject individually, separately from the background exposure. You can use aperture priority and auto ISO if you really want to, but I think it's much better to do this all manually because you will get just consistent results, and that's what you want. Now the next step is I want to introduce the flash onto the top of the camera, and I need to think about what I'm going to bounce my flash off of. There has to be something that's fairly neutral for this to work. Whites obviously work, but even greys and cream tones work. You can have a small amount of color in a wall or something and get away with it still. But if you have, for instance, a red wall, you need to know that when your white light hits that red wall, it's going to pick up that color cast, and then your light is going to become probably some sort of pink shade when it comes back towards your couple or your subject, whoever you're photographing. And you don't really want that. Fortunately, it's actually really easy to find a lot of surfaces that are white or, you know, a suitable color or a neutral tone or don't have too much color in them. It might also be sometimes that some locations when you're shooting, you might find that the ceiling is white, but the walls aren't. In that instance, I would lift this up at an angle. Let's talk about using the flash head and putting it into the right direction. So you'll have set your exposure manually in camera because you want your pictures to be consistent. You don't want the background ratio and the flash ratio on the subject changing all the time. This flash should go off to the side somewhere, but it can be that it's going diagonally backwards. That works as well. It doesn't have to just be sideways. It could be at a diagonal like this. Now, whether you tilt the flash up or down depends on a couple of things. If you are a wedding photographer, you need to be really careful about doing this because chances are there's someone standing there and they're going to get this in the face, which doesn't go down too well. I have done it a few times and people don't like it that much. So what I want to do is probably angle it up a bit like this, just to stop it going directly into people's faces. Again, as well, if it's a ceiling or a roof that's angled like this, I can bounce it. If it's a flat ceiling that's white, this still works. Weirdly, it still works. You think it wouldn't, but it does. You can still, if you haven't got a wall to bounce off of, but the ceiling is like a cream or a white, doing this works as well. You can angle the flash head 45 degrees upwards and still get away with it. Another thing you can test out as well, let's say you need to take a picture of a few people together. I know I'm using weddings sort of more as an example, but it covers a lot of the scenarios you could face. But this could be for portraits, it could be anything that you do. You can tilt the flash backwards as well. And that will give you straight on lighting, but it will be really soft and diffused. And it actually looks really good if you do this. So that's another option that you can use as well. And the last one that gets used sometimes as well is if you're just in a tight pinch and you need to get a picture of someone in front of you and there's nothing suitable to bounce off of. And let's say the ceiling's not even that good either. You'll notice that a lot of flashes come with this little bounce card. And that actually works surprisingly well if you fire it straight up. You can get a reasonably soft light using this and it works well. Now, when it comes to all the modifiers and mag mods and things and stuff that you can stick on the end of your flash, my opinion on this is don't bother. I think they're clumsy and clunky, plus what you gain in terms of spreading the light to soften it, you sort of lose in terms of direction. So think about it like this, right? You've got your flash head and it's firing out the light sideways. The more it spreads the light, the less directional it comes back. It's going to fill the room and give you a really soft light, but you're going to lose some of that direction because you're going to get a lot of light that's going off forwards and a lot of light going off backwards. Whereas I would rather keep the light more directional. Now, this picture that I'm showing you here was shot in a studio. It was shot off camera, but it could have well just been on camera because this was a bare speed light just aimed at the wall. And the only reason I put it on a light stand was because I didn't want to have to keep holding the thing on the top of the camera and changing it every time I went from portrait to landscape. This would have been absolutely exactly the same. Had I had the flash on the camera, the picture would have looked exactly the same. I think that once you get good at using bounce flash, you just don't need these things, these accessories that go on top of your flash. And the way to get really good at it is to just do it at home where you live and practice with it. But what you might find indoors, if your rooms are smaller, is that the flash is too strong, even on its weakest setting. And you won't find that when you're at a larger location. So the light loses power very quickly from the light as it comes out. And so as soon as the room gets just that bit bigger, the flash will blend in much better than it will do. When you try it at home, you might find that, especially if your rooms are smaller, that it's just overpowering everything. And if that's the case, bring your aperture down a bit, make your aperture a bit smaller in order to compensate. And then you can still practice this and understand these lighting angles so you get better at it. So I'm going to be working on a series on Patreon where I'm going to show the different examples of this and how to do it with the speed light and the different results you get. But at the same time, you can just practice this yourself and figure it out. And you need to know and understand, and in time you'll get better at it, and then it becomes second nature. Now we need to talk a little bit about the distance from your flash to the wall. A mistake that I've seen people do sometimes is that they kind of think they need to be really close to the wall to bounce the flash. And you don't want that. You want to be a reasonable distance away from it. Because if you're too close to it, the light's not going to spread enough. and it's just going to look like the light's still quite small and a bit harsh, and it's still going to have that sort of on-camera flash look if you're too close to the wall. You want to bounce it a good few meters and then it come back again. Now, if the wall is really far away, you might find another wall on the other side that's closer, or you might have to do that ceiling thing that I said before, where you diagonally aim it up towards the ceiling so it can come back in. But you need to understand as well that if the wall's really far, you're going to lose too much flash power, and by the time it comes back, it's just not going to have enough impact. A lot of places that you go to, like most normal sized buildings and so on, you won't have a problem bouncing flash. But if I'm standing, like if the wall is here, for example, and I'm close to it, then I'm not bouncing off this wall, I'm bouncing off the other one. Or if that then is too far away, I'm just going to tilt upwards and bounce off the ceiling. Does that make sense? So if I look at the wall, I'm like, oh, that's really far, then I'm just going to do that little ceiling bounce that I mentioned before, where I just tilt the flash upwards slightly to 45 degrees and then use the ceiling to bring it back in. It just makes life so much easier. And you want to think about bouncing off something that's like 3 meters away from you, maybe 4 or 5, something like that, and you'll have an easy experience with Bounce Flash. So if you found that useful, check out my Patreon link in the description down below. Give me a like, thumbs up if you enjoyed that, and subscribe if you're new here, and I'll see you again in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.